this week's episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Grab a seat at the table as Masters rowing coaches Marlene Royal and Rebecca Caro share their biggest secrets on how to unleash your hidden potential and plot a new course for real results on the water and off. Now, on to the show.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. I'm Rebecca Caro and today we're talking about rigging a longer stroke. But first, I want to give a massive shout out to Sean O'Reilly, who sent me a present. Take a look at this. And for those of you who are listening rather than watching, this is a 3D printed kind of S-bend in black, and it's designed to sit over your wing rigger, and it has two parts to it. The bit that sits closest to you, where the rigger is narrow, which has next to it a mount that's suitable for an NK stroke coach, and the other part, which is a big U-bend on the far side of the rigger, which is designed to fit your water bottle in. Now, I haven't tried it out yet, but massive shout out and thank you. And I believe this is something that he's going to be bringing to market. And you might be able to see close up here, there's a beautiful little silver fern, because Scott, although based in Australia, has a robust understanding of the, shall we say, similarities and differences between our two nations. Now, let's talk about rigging a longer stroke. Mostly, having your oar in the water for longer during the stroke, a greater distance. Let's be clear, we're talking distance here, not time. Mostly this is seen as being a good thing in rowing because of the principle of the lever. If you have a good lever and you can take the tip of the blade through a greater distance, you then move your boat a greater distance as well. We could argue that point, and I want to be really clear to listeners. I'm not an engineer. I did A-level physics, but I have an okay understanding of basic geometry and how this works. Just a quick reminder, our rowing oars and sculls work on the principle of the lever. They have a pivot point, which is the oar lock, based around the center of your pin, around which the shorter end, which is your handle end of the lever, is pulled or pushed, and the longer end, which is from the gate out to the tip of the blade, which is called the outboard generally, then goes into the water and helps to move the boat. Now, the ratio of inboard to outboard is an important principle to understand, because when you move the inboard, particularly if you shorten the inboard, you make your outboard longer, so long as the oar length hasn't changed, and that gives you more leverage. But you need a greater force. You need to work harder on the handle end to move the tip of the blade because you've got a larger load. It's like lifting a heavier weight. So let's start by talking about, is a longer stroke better? Well, define better. I don't want to go into semantics, but in general, as long as your athlete has the physical strength and power to move the oar through the water, yes, but there is a point of diminishing returns. And for those of you who are, like myself, amateur students of rowing history, you may know that the rowing sliding seat was invented in an attempt to increase the arc of that the oar can be rowed through. By rolling a seat forwards a little bit, you can get a greater reach forwards and a consequent greater pull through and lean backwards. By comparison, of course, with a fixed seat rowing boat. And initial proponents and users of the sliding seat quite quickly realized that a longer slide gives you a greater arc. And so slides nowadays are getting on for 60 centimeters plus long. And, you know, the amount that we use them depends on our physical height and our flexibility. And that's a conversation for another day. In balancing the strength of the athlete against the length of the oar, You also have to think about whether or not they have the handling skills to manage the oar such that you can put the oar in the water when you're at full reach at front stops, reaching toward the stern of the boat, so that you don't miss water. Slicing your oar into the water from great height misses water and means consequently that you have a shorter stroke through the water. Now, rigging a longer stroke is a really good solution for somebody who is less skilled and hasn't yet got the handling skills to get the oar in at full compression. So one thing a coach might suggest is that somebody with a shorter stroke, either due to their physical capability or their blade handling skills, you might suggest that they go on to a longer arc. And I've definitely done this myself, particularly when I'm teaching beginners. I will often shorten the inboard on their oar or scull handles so that I can move their foot stretcher closer to the stern, which means that when their oar does go in the water, even if they do slice it in, they are more likely to be putting it in at the same angle as other more experienced people in the boat, and that they get a slightly longer arc of effective work when the oar's actually in the water to power the boat. So although they might look like they're rowing on a really heavy gearing, when the oar is actually in the water, they're not going as far. And yes, the gearing is heavy, but they're also then moving it to the limit of their ability. And you can, of course, adjust this as they get more skillful. Similarly, if you have an extremely short athlete and you want to try and get their oar arcs the same as everybody else, adjusting to make their inboard shorter is a good thing to do. Generally, however, in that situation, you want to adjust the outboard as well so that the proportion ratio of inboard to outboard stays similar to them, because you don't want them to be over geared. They'll just get really, really tired really, really quickly. And they won't be able to push the oar through the water with the same speed as someone who's on a longer gearing and is physically taller. Now, let's go on to why and how this might be a useful thing to do as part of your rowing. So take a look at this. This is a rig diagram, which I have taken from an extremely generous correspondent of mine in the UK. And I will share the link to his slide presentation, which is on rowing angle changes. And I want to look at this diagram, which shows two things. Firstly, it shows the arc of inboard and outboard that a rower moves through. So here is the rower at the finish. Here is the rower at the catch. And as you can see, there's a little bar here that shows their extended arm. And the darker red shade is where they start. They start on this dotted line where it says the initial span. So the paler red shade of their head is where the span first starts. And they row through this dotted line out to a catch here. And then you can see that there is a reduced span. So they've moved the pin of the oarlock closer to the side of the boat. And the span difference is then shown in this solid line. And what I'm just looking at here is you're looking at the distance here between the solid line and the dotted line. Here it is at the finish. Here it is at the catch. And so the outcome that he arrives at, his decision, is the length of the arc is determined by the athlete's anthropometrics, which is basically your leg and arm length and your torso, your height, and also your flexibility. And there is a formula which Valery Kleshnev has derived, which you can use to calculate typical arc lengths. Basically, his, as he calls this, simple model assumes that the length of the arc the athlete can achieve is constant, regardless of changes to the span, which is where the pin is located, or the inboard or the stretcher position. And of course, in any scientific proof, you need to be very clear about what your assumptions are. because he says for very small changes of span or inboard and small movements of the stretcher, he believes this to be a reasonable assumption. Now, this is a really useful way of helping you to see from the rig diagram what happens as a result of you actually changing parts of the oar. Now, he goes through, he's called Stephen Aitken, and he goes through some of the faulty logic that people assume when doing rigging. One is only change one thing at one time, but that isn't always possible, because when you change one thing, for example, like the span, it also affects other parameters. So you have to understand that. And he basically goes through a really interesting set of options here, in which he sets out some of the different things that you can decide on span, on inboard, on stretcher positions, and then for sculling, the distance between the handles at the finish. And he sets them out in great detail. So, for example, option number 1 is you reduce the span, leave your inboard fixed, adjust the stretcher position, and leave the distance between the handles fixed. And so what he does is he explains what are the things that you could be looking at when you're considering how to lengthen the stroke or the rig in order to get a longer stroke. And this is really interesting because his conclusion is that there is only one option that actually works. And this is what he says: reducing the inboard and span equally and adjusting the foot stretcher to keep the handles at the finish the same works with increases in all the angles, the catch angle, the finish angle, and the sweep in total. And that, for me, is a really useful learning, because not all of us have time to mess around with doing all of the experiments. What he then goes on to say, which is a very useful rule of thumb, is that for a 1 centimeter inboard change on sweep, the change is 1.64 degrees if you are an athlete who's 183 centimeters tall. And so that sort of principle and the ratio, so the angle, is a really useful one if you want to get out a pen and paper and a protractor and work out what angle change you want to make. And changing 1 centimeter on the inboard is quite a big change for either sweep or sculling. He also observes that if you want to increase angles, first reduce the inboard, the required amount, so that you get the increase in the arc, which is the angle we were just talking about. And then he says, reduce the span equally. Now, I will link to this so that you can take a look for yourself. But I do think that this fits in with something that I mentioned last week when I said about standardizing rigs across your boat fleet for your club. And one of the things I mentioned at that point was to keep the inboards the same for all the different oar lengths, whether you're sweep or sculling, with the exception in sweep, obviously, of moving from 8s to 4s to pairs. That is a little different. Mostly, in my experience, rowing a double and rowing a quad, you can keep quite similar inboards for most masters, except for, the most elite competitive athletes who want to make these fine-tune adjustments to their own equipment when they are racing. So there you go. Some ideas about rigging a longer stroke. Do let me know if this is something that you've ever tried and whether or not you would find it useful in your own club or society. I hope you found this helpful. Till next time.
We are part of the Rowing Chat Podcast Network. Please tell your rowing friends about the show. And if you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.